All right, so today we are looking at the sign of feeding the 5,000 as a Maya guest. Good job. So, I don't know about you guys and how you guys' year has been so far. We got, what, 2 months, little over 2 months left now. But this year has, for me, been a series of impossible situations that I had to overcome, or rather, God helped me overcome, and is still helping me overcome. We know that things will always get easier, and the best years are still ahead of us. But also at the same time, we know that realistically speaking, there will also be worse years and harder years ahead of us as well. So simple fact is, regardless of how our lives turn out in the end, we face problems of all kinds every single day, whether big or small. But sometimes there are things that we come about in our lives that just is seemingly impossible to fix. So I have a story to share that I may have shared with you guys already, I'm not sure, but it illustrates a point pretty well. So there was a time that I was living in Los Angeles. It was from 2013 all the way to 2019. And this one year we went on a mission trip to Arizona with the Navajos. Anybody know who the Navajos are? They're the Native Indian people. Yeah, it's a tribe. Yep, Native Indian tribe. So, yeah, good. All right. So I was leading VBS for this particular missions, and right from the beginning, it was a series of very unfortunate events. So on our way to Navajo Nation, it was about, I want to say, 12 hours drive, but with breaks and everything, it took about 15 hours. But our trailer broke down within the first hour because we were hauling a trailer. And it took us a good 4.5, 5 hours to fix the trailer. And after we fixed it, we were on our way, and it broke down again half an hour later. We had to sleep near a city called Barstow. Does anybody know where Barstow is?
Somewhere or Sarasota?
No, it's in LA. It's actually on Route 66. So, yes. Okay, yeah. So we had to sleep at a Denny's parking lot just outside of Barstow. And when we actually got there, from the first day of missions, there was miscommunication between all the leaders and everybody that was there. And people were doing their own thing without communicating, without consulting the leaders and all of that. It was absolute chaos. And throughout that week, I made the single biggest leadership mistake that I have ever made, and probably hopefully will never make that sort of mistake again. So we were at a park doing the VBS, and it started raining unexpectedly. So without consulting the other leaders, just like how we were all doing, I decided on my own to move the VBS indoors. And unfortunately, this park was absolutely huge. And some of the parents that came late to register their kids decided to drop off their kids at the original site without registering them in. So the rain wasn't very heavy, it was extremely light rain all throughout, but those kids sat out in the rain, neglected till sundown. When the parents came to the park to pick up their kids, they saw their children completely neglected, and obviously they were all wearing wet clothes because it was raining. And some of them decided to call us in the middle of the night and said something along the lines of, "Is this where you drop off unwanted kids? And we want to speak to the leader of VBS. Who is that guy?" And it was not good. So it was absolutely terrible. And some of them even threatened to sue, but they had signed papers saying that under no circumstance they could sue, and they had signed their waivers, and so they weren't able to take any action. And those parents, they were upset, but they wound up bringing their kids the year after to the same VBS. So yeah, anyway, but in the moment I was completely
What they've done, and they were like, "Oh, this was my fault."
anyway, so at that moment I was completely shocked, and I could not believe the extent of my mistake. I lost all hope in my confidence as a leader at that point. But the pastor called me to the side, and he encouraged me one-on-one and prayed for me and all the things that pastors do. And many of the leaders who were working under me, because I was the leader of VBS, but many of the leaders that were working under me also came to my side, and they encouraged me with prayer and their words. There were shortcomings from myself and all of the other leaders, because yes, I made the mistake, but no other leaders were communicating either. And by the end of the missions, right, there were so many events that happened. Several kids broke out in fights, and when I say fights, I mean fist fights. And there were also some of the kids that were bullying some of our leaders. So our youngest leader was in 7th grade, and their oldest was in 6th grade. And so the 6th grade kid was bullying one of our 7th graders, and they had filmed it and posted it on their social media. So this was happening all throughout the week. But by the end of the missions, somehow those kids' lives were changed, and the troublemaker kids that were fist fighting and that were bullying our leaders were in the front row dancing to the VBS songs, and they were the ones that were raising their hands to answer all the questions about the Bible and things. So looking back, the mission trip felt like an impossible situation where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. I was overwhelmed, and I was discouraged, and I was convinced that I had failed. But somehow, God worked through it all and brought about good despite my mistakes and the chaos that we all faced. That experience reminds me of the story that we're about to dive into, the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus steps into an impossible situation with the crowd in need and has little to offer, and transforms it into a miracle. Let's turn to the passage for today and see how God works in these moments. So the first 4 verses give us the context of our passage. From verse 1 to 4, it tells us that the event happened in Galilee, where the Jewish close to the Jewish Passover festival. So it tells us that Jesus was performing miracles of healing sick people. Then Jesus withdrew from the mountains, withdrew to the mountains from his disciples. Now, if we see the other Gospels of the same story, it gives us a little more detail, and it gives us fuller context of this whole passage if we do a little bit of an additive storytelling. So Mark 6 tells us that the reason why Jesus withdrew was because his disciples had just returned from a mission trip. And while they were gone, Matthew chapter 11 verse 2 of today's passage, Matthew chapter 11 verse 2 tells us that Jesus was busy on his own doing ministry while the disciples were away doing missions. But Jesus knew that his disciples needed to rest and needed debriefing according to Mark 6. We had heard that John the Baptist had been executed by this point by Herod, and he wanted to withdraw from the people according to Matthew chapter 14. So all these things gave a reason on why Jesus wanted and needed, actually he needed to withdraw for his own mental health. He needed to withdraw in order to get away. One of his best friends and his relative had just been beheaded by King Herod. And then, while he wanted to be alone, a great number of people gathered around Jesus. And if we look at the same account in Mark chapter 6, verse 34, it tells us that the crowd was like sheep without a shepherd. In the other Gospels, it tells us the crowd was with Jesus for quite some time, almost a whole day, in fact. Now, this means that they had gone a whole day without food. Has anybody gone a whole day without food? Yeah? It's not fun, right? So it is so exhausting. And the crowd and the disciples had not eaten all day, and Jesus had not eaten all day either. So I assume that they were all going through an emotion called hangriness, right? Anybody heard of that term, hangry? Yeah, I get hangry all the time.
I felt that a lot last year.
Yeah.
When I had all my surgeries.
Okay. Yeah, so while you're hangry, right? Any little inconvenience makes you angry, right? So then Jesus went to Philip, who was probably hangry himself, and then he asks Philip in verse 5, "Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat?" And it tells us that Jesus asked in order to test Philip, for he himself knew what he would do. It says that Jesus already knew what was going to happen, but Philip obviously did not understand what was going to happen. And personally, I don't think any of us would have understood what was going to happen either. So this is the impossible situation that the disciples found themselves in. And Jesus threw this question out to test the disciples. His concern in many ways was the people and the fact that they were hungry, but on the other hand, his concern was also with the disciples and their faith. And in today's passage, we see two kinds of responses that the disciples had. First is Philip, and you can clearly read the frustrated tone that Philip gives here in verse 7. So he was probably answering out of his hangry anger. He says, "It would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Right? That's just like, it's kind of accusing Jesus of, trying to ask an impossible question. And Philip must have found Jesus' question absolutely absurd. And if something like this happened to me while I was hangry, having an unpleasant day, unpleasant words would have made it to the tip of my tongue, and I would have had to try extra hard in order to keep those words behind my tongue and keep those words to myself. But of course, it was Jesus that Philip was talking to, so he had to keep some sort of form of respect. Anyhow, so the first response is from Philip, and it is the "we cannot do" type. This type of person, anything that does not follow their idea of how things should work, including when God commands it, will doubt and question. And these are doubts and questions that come across all of our minds from time to time. And there are doubts and questions that come to our minds all the time. But this is not one of those types of doubts and questions. This is one of those people that tackle everything that's being said, and in anything, in word or action, or sometimes like even if it makes perfect sense, they will say something to tackle everything. And though there are cases like Philip where he was genuinely asking, like, how are we gonna get it, because it's going to take a lot of money to feed these people, there are people that are this type of person that ask questions just for the sake of asking questions, to be rebellious or divisive. Anyhow, the second type of people are the ones that are like Andrew. Verse 9 tells us that Andrew said, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" This is the yes, we can do something type of person. Now, Christmas season is kind of still far off, but it is coming soon. It starts on December 1st is when Advent starts. And many of us, I'm sure all of us actually, know the carol Little Drummer Boy. Has anybody not heard of the carol Little Drummer Boy? Anybody not heard of it? You haven't heard of it? Well, yes. So, Little Drummer Boy describes this type of person really well. Just to describe what happens in the song, there's a poor boy who goes to baby Jesus and Mary to meet Jesus. But unlike the Magi who had come before him, he's got no gift to offer to Jesus. So he decides that what Mary and Jesus needs, right? Has anybody been around babies? You don't want to wake up babies, right? You don't want to wake up babies. But this poor boy decides that playing a drum solo is what he can do for Mary and Jesus when,
I just like imagine baby Jesus sitting in
yeah.
There's just like some king playing class.
Yeah. That's right.
Or just
So
actually just going to him, just pouring it on him.
just imagine this, right? Mary's trying to get Jesus to go to sleep, and here comes a little drummer boy playing like what's it called, black metal blast beats and okay. So, but he believes that the best he can do is play the drums because that's all he can do. And this is the exact attitude that Andrew had. He is saying, I don't know how effective this will be, but hey, here's 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And when we are faced with impossible situation where God is trying to test us, what will our response be? Will we be like Philip and question the logic of what's going on? Or will we take action in faith? Faith, as described in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1, which I have reiterated various times, is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And this is exactly the sort of faith that people like Andrew had. Andrew did not know what the 2 fish and the 5 loaves could do, but he had the right understanding of who Jesus was as the Son of God and brought all that they had, which was 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, I talked about the missions in Arizona when we started, and man, I'm just describing the surface of what happened. You cannot imagine how many things went wrong. From 10-year-olds starting fist fights to kids hitting and bullying our youngest leader. It was a mess. But that did not matter. What mattered was that we gave it all, and despite their disrespectful attitude and offensive behavior, we did what we could. But at the end of the mission trip, all the students that were fighting, all the students that were causing trouble, and all the disrespectful students were the ones that were dancing to worship songs and were the loudest voices in worship. But giving it all is all we did. There was nothing else that we could do. We just did our best and prayed. Andrew brought to Jesus 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's all they had, and that is what Andrew gave him. But God makes beautiful things happen out of what little we have. It's not a matter of how much we have, but it's a question of giving it our best. And if our best is 5 loaves and 2 fish, God will take it. So, how will you respond when God is testing you, giving you a task to do? What will you do when you are faced with these types of impossible situations in your life? Now, I'm sure that even if we're acted to tempt like Philip, now that we know what sort of faith that God requires from us, I'm sure that God will also grant us the strength to be able to act like Andrew as well. And when Andrew brought forth what he had, Jesus worked a miracle. Verse 11 tells us that Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. Not only that, verse 13 tells us that they gathered all the leftovers and they filled 12 baskets with pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. When we bring what we can do to God, no matter how big or how small, God is the one who multiplies it and uses it for His glory and for His kingdom. We have to go through Jesus and filter everything through Jesus. And we also need to filter our problems and look at our problems through the eyes of Jesus and see them for what they truly are. So, we are on the series called A Series on Jesus. And so we have to look at the character of Jesus in our story. So who is Jesus and what is his nature? Verse 14 says, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into this world." Now, who is Jesus to me? Who is Jesus to you? Who is he to us? Now, what do these signs and wonders reveal about Jesus? We said at the beginning of the series on Jesus that signs and wonders are supposed to reveal the nature of Jesus, specifically that he is the Son of God. Another question we must ask has to do with us. We are called to be disciples of Jesus Christ, right? But as disciples, what is our responsibility? And what authority do we have as disciples of Jesus Christ? As disciples, we must remember that the laws of the way we think things should work is not relevant. Let me repeat that. We must remember that the laws of the way we think things should work is not relevant. Now, what is relevant? What is relevant is the fact that when God tests us, he simply asks us to give it our best shot. But one thing to remember is that if we are indeed going through a difficult times when we cannot make it on our own, we need to look to Jesus and not to our problems. If we see the response of Philip, he looked at the problem and said that in order to solve this problem that's in front of us, they would need half a year's wages to solve this problem. But if we look at Andrew and what he did, is that he brought the fish and the bread to Jesus. His focus was not on the problem, but his focus was on Jesus. And yes, if we're going through storms in our lives, we should ask God to help us to be able to get through the storm. And as we have been saying whenever we were talking about prayer, God desires that relationship with us, and the way we communicate with God is through prayer. So God desires conversations with us. But the important fact is, even when we are having this conversation with God, we need to keep our focus on Jesus and him alone. We need to remind ourselves who we are following. We're following Jesus, part of the Trinitarian God. And this is a responsibility that we have as disciples, to focus on Jesus. While we need to present what we're going through to God, we need to express ourselves to God honestly. The authority that we have as disciples is that we can declare to the storms in our lives how big our God is. So while you're expressing yourself to God and presenting your problems to him, present them for what they are. We don't need to tell God about how big our problems are. Instead, we need to tell our problems how big our God is. To conclude, we all go through difficult situations in life. Sometimes these difficult situations are small, and other times they're impossible to fix. Sometimes they're personal, and other times they are on a bigger scale. For example, when I went to the mission trip, that wasn't me personally, that was the whole group. And God often takes us through those situations to test us. Now, when we say the word test, I don't want us to think that God brings out situations in our lives for us to have the opportunity to sin. No, God doesn't tempt us, right? God tests us. There's a difference between the two. And God tests us to check our faith. And when He does, we can respond to God in one of two ways. We can have either the I cannot do attitude that Philip had, or we can treat the problem like Andrew, where we say, I don't know what or how to do this, but I will do what I can do type of attitude. Now, we don't need to try and think of things we cannot do. But instead, what we should do is we need to bring them to God and do what we can. And if the best we can do is 2 fish and 5 loaves, that is perfectly acceptable to God. And whatever that is in your context, that is perfectly acceptable to God. Because the focus should not be on our problems. The focus should not be on our abilities. The focus should be on Jesus and only Jesus, and we need to filter everything through Jesus. So no matter what you're going through or whatever you may go through in your life in the future, Jesus is the one who takes us through it. In fact, He is the only one who is able to take us through it. You cannot take yourself through it. Your parents cannot take you through it. Nothing in life other than Jesus can take you through it. So let's face our lives with boldness and humble confidence and declare to the storm about our God's greatness. Because remember, who's on your side, right? We have Jesus on our side. So we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Yes. Well, it strengthens me, but I'm just saying us because I'm talking to everybody. Yes. Strengthens me is the correct Bible verse. So well done.